Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce our first speaker. Jason, I won't share how long we've known each other as we were lamenting here this morning. It's been quite a while, and so it's been great to kind of follow Dr. Jason Sawyer's career, and so I'm honored that he's able to join us here today. He's a native of Texas, did his undergraduate degrees at Texas A&M, and then went on and did 2 graduate degrees at New Mexico State University, and then shortly after he graduated, then fell into an extension role there at Clayton, and that was where I got the opportunity to get to know Jason a little bit. And from there transitioned back to College Station, if you can imagine that for a Texan to want to go back to College Station. Was in a research and teaching role there, I believe, for a number of years, and then transitioned to the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management in Kingsville. Today, he is currently the Chief Science Officer for the East Foundation. Jason will share a little bit more about the East Foundation and what they do in Texas and really what their mission is. And so one of the reasons that we invited Jason to come to Cattlemen's Day was during his time at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management, he and a group of other individuals authored a paper essentially walking ranchers through the emerging carbon markets. And so as we looked at potential topics and ideas for Cattlemen's Day, we just felt that that was a topic that had not been covered in Kansas or talked about a whole lot, and so that seemed to fit very well to bring him back to Cattlemen's Day. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sawyer, and we'll get his presentation teed up here. So welcome to K-State.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Well, first, let me thank you for the kind introduction, and thank y'all for the privilege of being here with you today. I was telling Dr. Day earlier, as somebody who's been around this for a few minutes now, this continues to be really one of the premier events like it in the United States, and that's a testament to the program here at Kansas State, the support of the production community in Kansas and neighboring states, and it's a real privilege for me to have a chance to be here to visit with you. Is there a button I'm supposed to push? The other thing I'll say while we're figuring this out is I have this effect on technology. It's my magnetic personality. It creates these situations that somehow interrupt things. So, all right, there's my I know I'm supposed to get started cue. As Justin said, I'm not going to spend too long doing sort of commercial messages, but it's my best guess that I can't operate this deal either. But I can do it like that. To visit with you a little bit about East Foundation, and so, perfect, thank you. This particular topic is one that hopefully y'all are interested in, because I'm going to talk to you about it for a little while, and we'll do our best to make it interesting if you haven't heard of it before. But about 2.5 years ago now, with the King Ranch Institute, who is a primary partner of the East Foundation and how we execute our mission, had this simultaneous question, right, with work that we had been doing related to greenhouse gas and carbon balance in the beef supply chain. This notion of the importance of land in that equation was something that was apparent, but really emergent in other people's minds. And something that we really kind of take pride in, I guess, is the fact that we want to address research problems in the context of a land steward. That's why we exist. And so rather than starting on this at the esoteric level of, soil microbial transactions, we really wanted to think about this, and if we were presented with an opportunity to enter into this market as landowners and stewards, would we do it? What would I want to know? What would I need to understand in order to enable the best possible decision for my business and my family and the stakeholders involved in the ranch? And so that mindset is really kind of what started us down this path. As Justin mentioned, we constructed with King Ranch Institute and some partners at Texas A&M and East Foundation a white paper. I've got a website address there, that lower one, where you can go find that. And I'd encourage you to do it and look at some of the other great things King Ranch Institute has going on. A little bit about East Foundation. The East Foundation is a pretty unique entity. It's the first agricultural research organization in the United States. There are a number of medical research organizations, and these tend to be large family foundations that were established many years ago that have developed really large research presence in cooperation primarily with medical schools and universities. So an agricultural research organization like us has the legal requirement to do research in agricultural sciences in conjunction with land-grant universities and agricultural colleges in the United States. So the way we execute that mission is in partnership, like the example with the King Ranch Institute and with other university partners. The context for that, part of our mandate as a foundation, is that we must ranch. So the East family's primary goal was to make sure that their ranch never got broken up. So they placed it into trust with the requirement that research and education to benefit ranching and wildlife management be conducted in the context of a working ranch. So our mission is to promote the advancement of land stewardship through ranching science and education. The way we conduct research, the science part of our mission, and the way we develop educational opportunities is always through and in the context of a ranch. We operate about 220,000 acres in South Texas. You can see this map of kind of how our properties, they're not contiguous, not an uncommon situation down there. And we kind of go from our westernmost property, kind of our headquarters ranch at the San Antonio Viejo, to our easternmost property on the coast of Laguna Madre at El Sauz. Is about 110 miles as the crow flies. So just to kind of put some scale on the map for you there. Across these properties, we conduct a number of projects. We operate a primarily cow-calf operation in parts with some latent stocker operations. It's a going concern. Everything we do is in that context, which brings us back to this question of, if we were presented with the opportunity to enter into a carbon trade, would we do it? What would we want to know? How would we think about that? And so that's the journey I kind of want to take with you this morning. And before we do that, I think it's important to understand why such a market would even exist. I'm guessing that most of what I'm fixing to talk about is not new information for y'all. This is just to kind of get us on the same page and get us thinking. Every time I use this graphic, I recognize how terrible it is, so I apologize for that. But it comes from the Department of Energy, and so nobody can complain about my numbers. And it has everything on it. Now, I don't expect you to read and remember all those numbers. What I want you to think about is the big picture here. So there's the atmosphere up there, and there's some carbon-containing molecules that live up there. I think we're all aware of that. And stuff goes up, and stuff comes down. That's the carbon cycle. It happens. It's the way it was supposed to happen, right? And if we kind of took a snapshot, this data, these numbers on here are a couple of years old, but it hasn't materially changed from this other than rounding error. You would say that there's about 219 gigatons of carbon that are released into the atmosphere every year. And about 215 gigatons of carbon comes back out of the atmosphere every year into these pools that are releasing it. So it's a cycle, right? It goes up, it comes down. So what's the difference between 219 and 215? 4. About 2% of the transacted carbon is sort of remains in the atmosphere, right? There's a little bit more that goes up than comes down, and that results in an accumulation, right? If you have the faucet running faster than the drain can let it out of the bathtub fills up, right? And so that's really, in a nutshell, the thing that creates concern. That's the concern about greenhouse gas emissions rate, is this concern about accumulation in the atmosphere. Now, I recognize the audience I'm talking to, because I'm one of this audience, right? And for some of y'all already in your mind, you're like, yeah, I don't know about all that, accumulation. I mean, God made it that way. It's probably, are you sure it's a problem? I just want to just ask you to take a deep breath. Because certainly the public conversation about this, the chatter, the amount of stuff on the internet, you should take some of those things with a grain of salt. You shouldn't dismiss all of it entirely, right? Be skeptical, make your own decisions, draw your own conclusions. What I'm going to talk to you about is not concern expressed on your Twitter feed, but how we would view legitimate expression of concern. So what this graph is showing you here is over about the past 25 years or so, the amount of capital flow directed toward environmental, social, and governance investment objectives. So this is a real measurable thing, right? This is the capital allocated to businesses effectively across, really this is worldwide, but a lot of this is domiciled in the US. And what you see there is this dramatic uptick starting about 10 years ago, and that pace has escalated dramatically, and it continues on that pace. If I had 2021 on there, it would have flattened out for 1 year. 2022 is going to be right back on trend line. And that says that right now there's about $19 trillion of direct investment influenced by ESG considerations. That means that investors are allocating capital based on these general concerns about environmental quality, among other things. Now, whether you agree with them or not, clearly is not affecting their investment decision, right? That's an important thing for us to think about. Those dollars expressed in a different way, this was from 2020. The numbers I want to kind of point out to you here, I'm sort of reluctant to try to push a button on this. Top, okay. The one with the line on it that looks like, okay, I thought I was going to turn it off. So if it turns off right now, AJ. Okay, if we look right here, right, these are the specific criteria that these capital managers were considering. The largest pool of capital related to carbon and climate change. One of the fastest growing pools of capital, sustainable natural resources and agriculture. This is how concern is being expressed, right? That doesn't have anything to do with what's on your Twitter feed. What's the response to those kinds of expression of concern? Well, certainly the companies to whom that capital is being allocated respond. And you can see this headline is obviously a little bit aged now because that number has more than doubled, and probably about just under 1,000 of the world's 2,000 largest public corporations have made some sort of climate pledge at this point in time. That's a lot of capital, right? Why are they doing that? Well, maybe they're good citizens, maybe they're truly concerned, or maybe if they don't do it, all of that investment flow goes somewhere else. And the cost of capital acquisition for them, whether through debt or equity financing, goes up. So they're making a business decision, right? Doesn't have anything to do with their politics. It's a business decision. I put this last one on here. That company might not be one that you're familiar with, but they happen to be one of the largest commercial real estate management firms in the United States, and they own the building where my office is, so I thought that was an important one to put on there. So the business sector responds to that capital flow, and who else responds? The government responds, right? So they enact policy in part because of how it affects economic decision making. So all of that, right, and since I know that I'm not an economist, but there's one in the room, just in case y'all didn't know. When you have that sort of capital flow, right, the expression of concern that generates, people start making business decisions based upon that, then they have to do something about it. And so what did they do? They made a promise. We're going to be carbon neutral, net zero emissions favorable, they use some terminology, right, to express what their reaction and response is going to be. How are you doing, sir? And they've all made these pledges and promises, right? Here's a reality. Emissions cannot go to zero. Emissions cannot go to zero. I'm going to give y'all an example. I flew up here on American Airlines yesterday. What business is American Airlines in? They fly airplanes, right? To move people around, and people pay dearly for that privilege, don't they? Those airplanes run on Jet A. And they put those little wingtip things on there. Y'all seen those, right? Like the little curvy dealies, and some of them now have them going up and down on the ends of the wings. Why do they put those on there? To improve fuel efficiency, that's right. What does improving fuel efficiency means? They are reducing their emissions per passenger mile. Can they make emissions go to zero? Not unless they quit flying airplanes. And if they quit flying airplanes, do they still have a business? No. Okay? Emissions can't go to zero. They can put the little wing things on there and they can get them as low as possible, but there's some base amount that they just can't do anything about. So what are they going to do to get to net zero? Find somebody who can take some carbon out of the atmosphere on their behalf and pay them for that service. That's the idea here. Half of those companies that have made a net zero pledge have no plan for how they're going to do it. The other half have plans that, as you might have seen in the headlines with a company near and dear to your hearts, JBS. That was a joke. Y'all don't have to laugh at that. Some of those that do have plans, their plans are being publicly flogged. That's how it goes, right? But they need a solution, because who regulates those claims? If I say, I am a publicly traded corporation now, and anybody can buy stock in me in the hall after this if you want. That was also a joke. It's okay. It's okay. So if I'm a publicly traded corporation and I make a promise to the public, like I'm going to be net zero something, what if I don't do it? Who punishes me? Well, it depends. Remember the slides before this, right? Investors might punish me. They might say, you're breaking your promises and we're taking our capital away from you. That's the primary regulator. The secondary regulator is the federal government. And there's a proposed rule through the Securities Exchange Commission, not through the EPA, right? Through the SEC that says, if you made a promise to be net zero, you have to report on your progress toward that goal or face significant penalty. Okay, so the government isn't overtly regulating carbon emissions, but through the back door, they're at least proposing a mechanism to enforce promises made by companies. They didn't make the company make the promise, but they might make them keep it, right? That's a little bit to be determined. All of that means that there is the creation of demand for anti-CO2. American Airlines would love to be able to purchase some carbon accumulation somewhere and book it against those emissions they can't get rid of. So for those of us in the room today, the question is, are land-based solutions a potential answer? Well, let's think about that from a landowner's perspective. If I was going to enter this trade, right, hopefully you're at least convinced. I'm not asking you to be convinced about whether or not all of this should be happening. I'm asking you to accept that it has. And in that market environment, what is your business decision going to be? Well, you might need to know some stuff, and I think what you might need to know revolves around the 5 W's and 1 H. I never could as a kid figure out the H on that, but what's the deliverable? Who's involved in these trades? How does it all work? When do you have to deliver it? Why should you even consider it? and where's the risk? And so we're going to talk about those things. We give us a brief review. That graph, that image that I said was hard to read, this is my cartoon simplified version of it. Because most of the time when we think about what is the deliverable in this trade, it is a carbon credit. What is a carbon credit? Why is it called that? Well, this is why it's called that. If we view the atmosphere as an account, an emission, an increase in that account is a debit, and a reduction in that account is a credit. So if I reduce the atmospheric account of carbon, that's a carbon credit. Make sense? So if you didn't learn anything else today, you'll know why it's called a carbon credit. Okay, back to our kind of just simple accounting on this. If you have something and you put more into the account than you take out, what happens to the size of the account? It gets bigger. If you take more out of the account, this is like my checking account, than you put in, it gets smaller, right? This isn't hard. We understand this. In our financial accounting, the units of that movement, right, the 215 here would be dollars, right? In carbon accounting, the units are not dollars, they're tons of carbon dioxide. Let's think about it like that, okay? So now that I know what we're talking about with a carbon credit, okay, that's good. You gave me an accounting example. I hated accounting. That's why I'm not at accounting day, right? But if that's your case, well, what is that carbon credit really? Well, it's a metric ton of carbon dioxide. And the important thing there is it's a metric ton of carbon dioxide, not carbon. If you go take a soil sample, send it to the soil lab here at Kansas State University, and they measure some stuff in there for you, and one of the things there is percent C. That's plain old carbon, not carbon dioxide, right? So 1 unit of plain old carbon is equivalent to 3.67 units of carbon dioxide. Just know that. That credit, that ton, right, is like I'm buying an exchangeable permit. If I buy a carbon credit from you, you've taken a ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sort of given it to me. I can go over here to my carbon emissions account, right, and I can book that credit against my debits to cancel them out. Does that make sense? That's how we would get to carbon neutral, right, if I balance those accounts. The thing is, it's supposed to represent removal from the atmosphere, and it's supposed to be a permanent removal. Because like my checking account, if I put some money in there, my wife takes it right back out, it's like nothing ever happened, right? So if you take some carbon out of the atmosphere, remember the Earth does that 215 times a year, right? If it takes some carbon out of the atmosphere and then just throws it right back up there, we didn't do anything. So this is talking about permanent removal. And the credit generation, how do we decide if that really happened, right? Well, there's rules. So that generation, the issuance of a certificate that says there's a carbon credit that's been generated, are governed by some standard. So that means some people got together and wrote the rules that said, okay, here's how you do this, here's how you measure it, here's the activities that you might undertake in order to capture that carbon, here's all the stuff you have to do. And there's kind of 3 primary buckets that we think about there. The first one, and the one I'm going to talk almost exclusively about today, is accumulation in the soil. How plants take carbon from the atmosphere, transfer it through photosynthesis into a more stable form, if you want to think of it that way, and translocate it into the soil, and it stays there permanently-ish. And that's the one we're going to talk about the most. Another one that increasingly is talked about is direct air capture, or carbon capture and underground storage, CCUS. I'll refer to those by those different acronyms. I have like 1 slide about that, okay, so don't worry about it too much. And then the third bucket is avoided emissions. This one's a little tricky. This one says, maybe you have some prairie land, tallgrass prairie in Kansas, that has been managed impeccably for generations. And it has a large store of soil carbon. Now, you could build a shopping mall on it, and that might be valuable. I wouldn't pass judgment on you, right? I wouldn't. You'd have to make that decision. If you did that, they're going to turn all that ground upside down, and a lot of that carbon is going to be released. So somebody might be willing to pay you to continue to store it rather than let it go. That would be an avoided emissions or an avoided conversion. So those are the three big buckets. Each of those might have multiple standards, multiple sets of rules that somebody wrote about how you can do it. Now, in any of those standards, there's going to be some fine print. We'll probably talk a little bit more about each of these. You can read what's up there, but I want you to remember additionality and permanence and leakage. Now, additionality is this idea that whatever I did to generate the carbon credit captured more carbon than would have been captured otherwise. The idea of permanence is more obvious, right? Permanent means forever. Can you measure forever? That's hard, right? There's rules against perpetuity in real estate transactions, for example. So, because it's hard to do forever, right? And then the last one is leakage, and this is the only time, I might mention it one other time, this is probably the only time I'll talk about it. Leakage means this. Let's say that you had a forest that you were going to cut down because you're in the logging business. And when you cut that forest down, that counts as a carbon release. And somebody says, I'll tell you what, I'll pay you some money not to cut the trees down. And you say, fine, because cutting trees down is kind of a lot of work, I won't. You take the check. That means there's that many fewer board feet of lumber in the marketplace today, and that might mean that somebody in some other faraway place cuts down an extra acre of trees to make up for the ones you didn't, which would be a reasonable thing for them to do because you not putting that board feet of lumber into the market did what to the price? It made it go up. So they have incentive to go cut down an extra acre and capture that margin. Does that make sense? But then what happened to the atmospheric overall account? You didn't put some up there, but they put it up there for you, right? So that's leakage. Your action causes a reaction somewhere else that offsets your good work, okay? And so many of these rules have a provision about leakage. Here's what additionality kind of boils down to, the physical side of it. I want you to imagine that black line there is how much carbon is in your soil right now. I want you to imagine that because you're a good land manager and you practice range management that is designed to improve the characteristics of your land over time, and one of the byproducts of that might be an accumulation of carbon in the soil. And so if you manage how you manage, that blue line represents carbon in your soil over time. It's going up because you're doing such a good job. You decide to do another thing, change a grazing practice or implement some nuclear resonance flux capacitor overflight. I made that up, right? That's not a real thing. But something, right, some management activity that you're going to implement that's going to further increase the accumulation rate of carbon in your soil. That's the green line. Y'all with me? Okay, check this out. There's two ways I could think about how many carbon credits got generated in this deal. The first way would be just to look at everything above the baseline. So I measured it over here in year 0, and you had 1 unit of carbon in the soil. And I come back and 10 years later, I measure it, and now you have, I'm looking at the blue line here, 2 units, or really, you change that management practice, you have 2.5 units now. You got 1.5 more units than you started with, right? That's how many credits I could issue to you. That's the change in your soil carbon that represents atmospheric accumulation. Now, somebody might say, wait a minute. You're going to get to the 2 anyway. That was going to happen anyway. Why should I pay you for that? Right? I'm only going to pay you for the difference between what would have happened anyway and what happened because you changed your management. That means instead of getting 1.5 credits, I'm only going to pay you for 1/2 credit. Does that idea make sense? Which one would y'all pay for? Which one do you think it should be? You want to get paid for 1.5 or you want to get paid for 1/2? It's not a trick question. I mean, I know which one I want to get paid for, right? 1.5. Here's the thing. Are y'all all taxpayers? You don't have to answer that. But purportedly taxpayers? What if the government was going to buy these credits and they were going to use tax dollars to do it? You want them to buy 1.5 here or 1/2? What? Wait a minute, I thought y'all said you wanted 1.5. But now that it's your tax dollars at work, you're like, whoa. They were going to get that one anyway. I don't need to pay them for that. Just pay for the extra, right? You see the difference in perspective. This rule, the interpretation about only pay for above the baseline, is part of what's known as the Kyoto Protocol. It's an agreement signed by many countries in the world, part of the UN's climate accords. And it says that additional carbon accumulation is the only thing that should be credited, and that's that little bit up there. Now, the United States of America did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, and the carbon markets in the U.S. are voluntary, so some rule maker can decide which one of those they want to do. Fair enough? Here's another little tidbit about additionality. There's a secondary definition in the Kyoto Protocol that says, if the practice that you implemented to go from blue to green was profitable, in other words, you made more money because you implemented that good management practice, then you can't get a carbon credit for it. Why not? Because if it was profitable, you should have done it anyway, right? And their framework is spending tax dollars to buy the credits, so don't pay for anything you don't have to. In the US, we take a dim view of that because we want to get paid for all the stuff. And that's fine. I just want you to understand what's in play here. So who's involved? The standard setters, we've already talked about them. They make the rules, whatever rules, and they're all different. It's important to read the standards and know what rules you're supposed to be playing by, especially that additionality and permanence part, because they're different. There's different definitions. Then you have I'm going to go diagonal to a registry. A registry is who keeps track of who has generated and been issued credits, who's sold them, bought them, and otherwise exchanged them, and then who uses them. If a company buys them to offset their emissions, they have to retire that credit so it can't get used again. You have a verifier, somebody who checks whether or not you followed the rules, and then you have a developer, and this is the person who's going to do all the work, right, to get the credits issued. And so I think it's easier to look at this in this way. You have the landowner, that's us, right? We're interested in this. We go to a developer, somebody who's trying to make a market in the carbon trade, and we say, I'd like to sell some carbon. Can you help me? And they say, sure. And they say, let's look at your operation, let's look at what's going on. Let's pick the best rules to play by. And they go find a standard setter in a registry that has a set of rules that you can work with. Make sense? They do all the work, accumulate the data, send it to the registry and say, we'd like some carbon credits issued, please. The registry, you can be the developer, right? The landowner and the developer could be the same person, just as a side note. The registry is going to take all that accumulated data, they're going to hand it off to a third-party auditor who's going to look and make sure, did you follow all the rules? Did you do the stuff you were supposed to do to get the credit issued? And that has to be a third-party auditor. Why? Well, because the registry has a vested interest in issuing you credits, right? So they might fudge it a little bit and just rubber stamp stuff. And so to keep these things on the up and up, they send it off to a verifier. The verifier says, yep, they did it right. Registry calls the developer, says, yep, here's some credits. Developer says to you, hey, we got some credits to sell. What do you want me to do? You say, sell them. That's why we did this. Developer calls a broker, just like he would in any other market-making situation. The broker finds a buyer. Buyer buys the credits. Remember, the developer and the broker could be the same person. And remember that you could be the developer. That means you could also be the broker. Sidebar. Okay, after that buyer buys them, they call the registry and say, hey, I bought those credits. I'm American Airlines. I burned some Jet A. I bought this credit. I'm using it to offset some of my Jet A burning. Registry says, thanks for letting us know. That credit gets applied to their debit and canceled out. Can't be traded again. Make sense? That's how it works. When do you have to deliver this? So I tend to think, you might tell already, I tend to think of this as delivery against a commodities contract, right? That's kind of how this whole thing is structured. So if I'm going to deliver a load of feeder cattle in August, I know when I'm supposed to deliver them, right? I know how much I'm supposed to deliver, 50,000 pounds. And I know what happens if I can't deliver it, right? We'll get to that one. So the when you deliver it is the performance period according to your standard. It could be as little as 10 years. There is a standard pretty active in the US right now with a 10-year performance period. There are some that are 100 plus years. There are even some that say forever. And the way that they're going to try to assure that is to say that you can only issue credits from your land if you place it into a permanent easement of some sort, forever. So they're all different. You guarantee that storage. Typically, you're guaranteeing this year's. In 2023, I'm going to store up a ton of carbon on my land. I guarantee it for 10 years. So come back in 10 years and check. If it's still there, pay me. Sound reasonable? It's like my August feeder cattle, right? I mean, I got to deliver them in August. I'm just talking about August of 2033 now, okay? That's a long time to wait for a check. So just like your feeder cattle, you could go to somebody who would be willing to issue you a payment, a prepayment against that future delivery, right? Your banker, for example, might say, okay, I know you're going to deliver them. I'll give you a little operating note on that, kind of against those cattle as security. So somebody might issue you a prepayment for that credit that won't actually be verified and proven for 10 more years. What would happen if you got 10 years down the road and they're like, okay, I came for that credit, and you went, I don't know where that thing went. I was pretty sure I had it. What happens then? That's a good question, and it depends on the contract you sign, but it can be pretty serious. Like could be owning your ranch depending on how many credits you sold them. So you need to pay attention to those things, and the delivery period is important, and the terms of prepayment is important, because what if you can't deliver? Now, right now, at this point, y'all are like, this whole thing sounds a little bit sketchy. I'm not sure I want to do that. I don't know why anybody even think about doing this. Sounds pretty risky to me. Some of y'all are like, I bet I could make this deal work, because you always have sort of hedgers and speculators in the room, you know what I mean? So why would anybody consider doing this? So I want to walk through this with you as quickly as possible, because this is the part most people are interested in, right? Down the left-hand column there, we have an amount. This is your anticipated amount of carbon that you could accumulate on your piece of land in a year. And it says mg, that's megagrams. That's a ton, okay? That's a metric ton. And remember, though, 1 metric ton of carbon is 3.67 metric tons of CO2. So for every ton of carbon, you get 3.7 credits, right? So I've got that listed there. The broker, the developer, those market makers, they're going to take a commission out of the trade. It's about 20% typically. They're also going to take another 20% out of the gross and set it in escrow as a hedge against your failure to possibly deliver in the future, okay? Now, what that means is if every year I enter into, I'm going to generate however much credits that year for delivery 10 years from now. I'm going to do that every year for 10 years in a row. I'm going to take a prepayment less those deductions. Does that make sense? And then at the end of 10 years, I'm going to stop signing new contracts. But in year 11, I've delivered against my year 1 commitment. Does that make sense? And I did it. So they give me my deposit back. I get the 20% back 10 years later. So I'm going to get little residual checks for 10 more years, right? So I'm talking about a 20-year overall play on this particular example. Does that make sense? Here's what it's worth gross. So notice the fine print, no sampling cost deductions. This is just known sort of market costs, right? If I generate 1 ton per acre of carbon every year for 10 years, sell them all, get my residual checks for the next 10 years, at the end of 20 years, the net present value of those cash flows is $450 an acre. What that effectively means is my capacity to do this today would increase the value of my ranch by $450 an acre. That's the clearest way I know to think about that. Does that work? If I could only do 1/10 of a ton a year, it's worth $45 an acre, which is, something, right? If I could do 2 ton an acre, almost $1,000 an acre increase in value. I'm not saying you get a check for $1,000 the first day, okay? Don't misinterpret that. Here's the thing though, sampling is not free. If I have to pay $60 an acre for initial sampling, for that process to unfold, look what happens to the value proposition, right? Now, if I can't make at least 1/2 ton an acre a year for 10 years, it's a loser. If I can make 2 ton an acre a year, it cuts the proposition in half. Now it's about $500 an acre instead of just under 1,000. That sampling cost piece matters. What is the sampling cost? I don't know. I don't know. Here's why. One, can you manage the rate of uptake? Could you control whether there was 1/2 ton an acre or 2 tons an acre? Is there something within your capacity to do? I don't know. That's the big question right now in the research community, isn't it? We're doing work right now. We're interested in management practices like prescribed fire, things that we do on a routine basis. Does that help us or hurt us? Things like brush control, does that help us or hurt us? I could make the hypothetical case either way, but I don't know. What can you do? Can you actually control it? Is there a limit on your soils? Is there a certain upper limit of how much carbon it's going to store up? I don't know. Nobody else knows either if they're honest with you. There's some reason to think that there probably is an upper limit. There's some reason to think you might be so far from it, it doesn't matter. But we don't know. Can you measure the change even if it happens? Guess what I'm going to say to that? I'm going to actually show you that one here in just a second. You also have some systemic risk. Additionality, permanence, and leakage. We've already talked about those. And then you have this other piece of systemic risk about rule changes. What if they change the rules halfway through your 10-year commitment? I guess you stick with the original contract, right? You're usually protected. But what if the public decides that these things are worthless? Do you think that could happen? You might be familiar with the Chicago Climate Exchange, a functioning exchange trading in futures on carbon credits 20 years ago. Anybody traded there recently? No, it went defunct, went bankrupt, price went to zero, everybody left. You know why? Because an environmental group sued the state of California and said these credits aren't real. You can't prove that they're real. And you know what? They couldn't prove that they were real. Doesn't mean that they weren't, just means they couldn't prove it. So the entire market folded. Is there delivery risk? Yes. This is data accumulated over 10 years at each of these listed sites across primarily the western United States. This is USDA data from USDA research stations. The dots show you the average carbon accumulation per acre. The bars show you the annual variability, right? That means that at every one of these sites, there was at least 1 or 2 years within that 10-year span where they accumulated carbon in the soil, and at least 1 or 2 years where they didn't, where they gave it back. The variability on that process is pretty high, and I don't know what we can do about managing that, and here's why. This data actually comes from San Antonio Viejo Ranch, our headquarters ranch at East Foundation. This is a large pasture right in the middle of the ranch. This is a 20,000 acre pasture, no cross fences on it. The blue bars represent rainfall on that pasture over this period of time, and the green bar represents forage accumulation. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that that green line's an uptrend, right? I'm going to say that's because of powerful management strategies that have improved our capacity over time. We've made the country better. I can't really say that, but I'm going to just because it makes me feel good. What do you notice, though, about the green line? Pretty wavy, isn't it? How does carbon get in the soil? From plants growing effectively and moving carbon to the soil. So those years where the plants didn't grow very much, guess what happened to the carbon in the soil? It probably left. Can I control that? The uptrend, I'll take credit for management-wise, even though I know it probably wasn't me. I know it wasn't me because I wasn't there. But even if we could manage the trend, can I manage the individual variation? Not unless you can start controlling rainfall. I'll show you a little bit more about our capacity to measure. So we've been doing work related to this to get at sampling costs. How many samples do I need to take in order to detect a change? I want to point out, any of y'all look at soil samples, maybe because you farm or apply fertilizer or something like that? If so, you might look at your soil organic matter numbers, divide them in half, and that's approximately your soil organic carbon. I want you to know that on that report, you get a percent, right? Percent organic matter, percent carbon. And 1 credit per acre, 1 ton of carbon per acre is a change on your report of 0.014%. That means it went from 0.56% to 0.574. The instrument they use in the laboratory to measure the change can only detect a difference of 0.04, ladies and gentlemen. You have to get 3 times this change before the instrument they used in the lab can even detect it. That's not good. This is work that we've done at one of our ranches on the coast. This is a burning study, so we collected samples immediately prior to and immediately following a prescribed fire, and then waited a year and measured it again. If we look at the total change in carbon, that's not a very long span of time. The important thing here is that on the average across all those sites, we had both positive and negative changes that resulted from that activity. And more importantly, I want you to pay attention to the numbers in parentheses. This is the coefficient of variation, a way for us to think about the variability in that change across those locations. The variability in the change was as high as 600%. That means for me to detect a real change, I would have to collect thousands and thousands of samples. And if every sample cost me $300, I probably can't make this deal work. And so we're really focused on this part about sampling, variability, and the delivery risk associated with this trade, because we feel like those are the most important unknowns right now that might have a technical solution. What's one of the technical solutions? Use satellites to measure soil carbon, right? Then it's real cheap to sample. And there are people desperately working on that all across the United States today. Stanford University is having a webinar, and I was trying to commit the date to memory. It's within the next few days, specifically about the capacity to detect soil carbon change using remote sensing technologies. Because there's a lot of startup venture capital applied to that. Okay, last thing, I told you I was going to have one slide about other than soil stuff, because this has recently become an important topic. So I mentioned direct air capture, carbon capture, and underground storage. These are things, how does this affect a landowner? Well, notice it says there, that headline, pore space gains value as CCS picks up. So this is at the other end of the spectrum from the land-based solutions we're talking about. This is about putting a machine out like a giant vacuum cleaner that's going to suck CO2 out of the air and clean it up and make it pure and then inject it into a hole in the ground forever, right? That's direct air capture and storage. Or you put a little device on the flue of a power plant and you take all the carbon dioxide out of that exhaust and you push it downhole, right? But landowners, the surface estate owns the holes. The mineral estate owns the oil that might have come out of that hole in the past, but the surface estate owns the rocks around where the oil was. Does that make sense? That means if somebody wanted to do this on your land, they would have to lease you, kind of the opposite of an oil lease, right? Like you would get a royalty from whatever they stored. This was pie in the sky type stuff prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. If you look down there, that says $60 per credit for every ton of CO2 that somebody uses for enhanced oil recovery. I can push CO2 into a depleted reservoir, repressurize it, and get oil to come back out, right? Every ton of CO2 I use for that, I get paid $60. On top of the $65 now, maybe $120 worth of oil that came up. Does that make sense? If I don't get any oil back, if I capture it out of a power plant smokestack and push it downhole, that credit used to be $50 a ton, now it's $85. If I build the Rube Goldberg machine, ladies and gentlemen, that can suck it out of the air and stick it in the ground forever, every ton I can put underground, $180 a ton of credit, tax credit. That's a lot of incentive for people to go out and invent the machine. That also means that for landowners, our focus on land-based solutions in terms of plant growth and accumulation might temporarily get sort of set aside for more industrial type applications, but there is a real opportunity there that you should be aware of. A large ranch that neighbors one of our ranches, actually they neighbor everybody's ranch in South Texas, had made headlines recently. They signed a 105,000 acre surface lease for underground storage of carbon. It doesn't compete with any mineral interests that are there, right? It's complementary use. So that's maybe that's why it's the last slide, because this is kind of an emerging thing. With that, I hope that I've at least given you some things to think about this morning. I hope I haven't abused my time too much. I do appreciate being here with y'all, and this list of challenges and opportunities are the things we would think about if we were considering this trade. Unfortunately, the answers don't always exist. But if we can ask the right questions, we can decide what's our appetite for risk and what's our capability to enter into something like this on the front end. If there's anything that I can visit with you about or answer for you, I'll do my best. No promises. I've already admitted I don't know anything, so that makes the questions a little easier. And but with that, I won't keep kicking it. But I appreciate y'all's time and patience with me, and appreciate the chance to be here today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Justin.
So we've got time for a few questions. What we'll do, I believe, so that the audience in the auditorium can hear, is we will run this mic to you. So if you can hold your question until we get that mic to you, that'll allow them to be able to hear those questions as well. So if there's any questions from the audience.
Hey, I have about 12 questions, so I'm just going to hit you with one or two. My biggest concern is, and maybe this is a comment, so I ranch in the Flint Hills,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
And let's just say that I'm a spectacular grass manager.
I'm confident you are. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if I am or not, but there are no other things that I can do on top of to reach that half a ton additionality. So I am really anxious to see if there is a way that we can get paid for just keeping my land in grass.
Yes, ma'am.
Although you know I'm going to keep it in grass
Yes,
no
ma'am.
matter what. So there's a dilemma for me with the whole conversation and what they will do for me. But let's,
okay, I'm
I
sorry,
don't
I'm
know
sorry,
that
go
that
ahead.
was a question unless you have a comment
I
with
can,
that.
I can make it into a question
Go
pretty
ahead,
easy.
but I have another one that's more important, so.
Okay.
Okay, so
go.
my really important question in my mind is I'm also involved in the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I am really interested in making sure that we are able to prove that American beef is sustainable. We have set one of those goals, a climate reduction or net zero goal, that by 2040, the American beef supply will not add to the warming potential, right? So I'm concerned that if everybody in this room sells to American Airlines their carbon credits, what happens to then the American beef supply? We can't use that same offset. And do I understand that correctly?
Yes, ma'am. So 2 excellent points. So I flashed to this slide. I'll come back to it in a second. Let's take the first comment first. So the notion of, I don't know that I can gain any more. I can't change anything to make it more than it currently is. Can I meet an additionality requirement? Well, again, not under Kyoto, but under some of the voluntary standards that have been developed in the U.S., you could, because the additionality is just changed from now till later, right? Not because you did something extra, no required practice implementation. Then you said, well, what about maybe I could do the avoided conversion thing, right? And if you think about it, are y'all familiar with conservation easements? So in a way, even though it's not specifically because of carbon, a conservation easement is already a vehicle by which people can extract some equity or value from the ranch, right, in exchange for forfeiture of development rights. In other words, I'm going to avoid converting it to a shopping mall. Now, should you plus up the value of a conservation easement because you can now attach carbon value to it? That would be the way I would think about that one, right? Here's the real problem on the avoided conversion thing in your example. Under Kyoto, right, that same additionality clause applies. If you already know that there is 0 probability that that land would be converted, in other words, it's already under a conservation easement, then there's no additional benefit, right? And so that's one of the concerns and limitations. The avoided conversion concept is one that's important, but actually has been really difficult to establish rules that people are willing to invest in. Second part, if you notice down here, and I felt like I was going way over time because I'm not a good judge of time, in case y'all couldn't tell. Notice that related opportunities. I talked about the 45Q stuff, that's the direct capture stuff and all that, but just above that I say total ecosystem services, that would be other things in the space, right? Biodiversity credits, water quality credits, other ecosystem services in addition to sort of atmospheric benefit. And then I said insets. So back to this question about supply chain. If I could generate a verifiable credit, I could do 2 things with it. I could sell it to American Airlines, as you indicated, or I could apply it to my own carbon account to reduce my own emissions profile. And then any product that I produce could maintain that attribute. So I mentioned the direct air capture thing, and Occidental Petroleum, the company you know as Oxy, has made a big bet. They're building direct air capture in the Permian Basin for the explicit purpose of creating a net zero barrel of oil. Wrap your mind around that little Twinkie, right? They can put enough carbon in the ground that the oil they get back generates, when you burn it, generates no net emission because they put so much in the ground ahead of it. Does that make sense? Now that's marketing genius right there, ladies and gentlemen. So the question about the beef supply chain. Is the beef supply chain so burdened that I shouldn't sell my credits to American Airlines? I should put them into the beef supply chain. Possibly. here, I put this chart up here, not because I anticipated the question, but because it happens that we've done a lot of work around this, and y'all might have seen some of this through NCBA or some other places, people that we were contractors for. The blue dots there represent beef emissions using sort of a newer evaluation for methane. And if we took just average expectations about natural carbon accumulation in U.S. grazing lands and applied that to the beef supply chain, it would suggest the beef supply chain has already been carbon negative since the late 80s. If that's the case, to your point, if you wanted to make sure that the beef supply chain was at least neutral, and you didn't want to sell off any extra credits, right, to jeopardize that, you would only be able to sell that many, not from the blue line to there. You would just sell the marginal accumulation that you had to maintain the priority on the product. So it's possible. Does anybody believe this? I mean, I believe it because it's my data. I did it, right? So I believe it. Does anybody else believe it?
So my concern with that
Give it
is, though,
5
that
years.
we are at a point right now where our cow herd is really low. And so with GWP Star, we look good. I mean, with our declining numbers of cow herd, but what happens when the drought breaks, right?
Yeah, it'll bounce around. So if you
Yeah.
notice the little wiggles out there from about mid-2020s to 2050, those little bumps, that recognizes typical oscillation in the U.S. beef inventory.
So you're predicting that we're gonna, our
You can see
total
it goes
cow
up
herd
and then it
numbers are
comes
gonna
back.
kind of sort of stabilize from here
No,
on out.
ma'am, I'm expecting they'll go up a little bit,
Right.
consistent with historical upticks in the cycle. Then they'll level off, and then they'll go down again, according to typical oscillation in the cycle. And that what you see, those bumps going out beyond, because obviously I only have real data here up until about 2021. Everything, all the noise in that chart after that is strictly because of oscillation in beef inventory, cattle inventory.
Thank you for your time. This
You
is
bet. Great
absolutely awesome
Great
information.
questions. Yes, sir. Right behind you there.
So how does if we graze the land, how does that affect the carbon that comes out of the soil, or does any come out? Because if we just sell those credits, then that land sits still and it's not making us any money.
Absolutely. Great question. So I want to first be clear, right, that none of this supposes that you have to stop using your land. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that grazing itself stimulates enough additional plant growth to actually increase the level of carbon accumulation. It doesn't decrease it, assuming you have reasonable grazing practices, right? We don't want to scalp it, right? Because if we take it all off, which would be detrimental over time to those plants' ability to continue to grow, right? And if the plants can't continue to grow, they can't continue to put carbon into the soil. So we need to balance our grazing use. In the same way, this is no different than any classic range management idea that you've ever had. So a general answer to your question is, if you're gonna do this, if you're currently a grazing operator and you were gonna do this, don't stop grazing. That'll make it worse, not better. But manage your grazing as effectively as possible, because the way you manage your grazing to promote more and more robust plant growth is the most likely way for you to increase the amount of carbon uptake into the soil. So short answer is, grazing is neutral to beneficial to carbon storage. It's never detrimental unless it's practiced in a negative way. Did I answer your question okay?
Yes, thank you.
You betcha.
We're not done yet, so if you have another question, let me know.
I guess I shouldn't have admitted so much ignorance then, because now y'all feel bad. You don't want to ask me stuff. You're like, well, we don't want to show him up like that. He's already said he doesn't know anything.
I did it just to
sir.
make
got
you
one
walk
in
up
the
here,
back, and then
Justin.
I'll give you my mic.
No, I guess I have, I know some of my students that I have, I remember when I was in school, college 30 years ago, and there's stuff you'd hear, and you think, oh, that's crazy talk. And then I say, guess what, 30 years later, it's happened. You know, there's a lot of talk about cattle contributing too much to to greenhouse gases through methane production. And, you know, we see pretty pictures of cows out in the Flint Hills. That's maybe not as big a deal, but what about the feed yards and other places where there's concentrations, high concentrations of animals? I guess I have concerns about how that could in the future work out. And I guess I don't know where my question is exactly, but I have some skepticism about some of this because of, is there regulations that are coming that are really going to rock our industry big time, but also change our food supply? So.
No, great question. I'm gonna try to address that, right? So the notion here is, well, 30 years ago, we would have thought anybody even talking about all this as being jeopardizing to American airlines that's foolishness, much less the United States agriculture infrastructure. And today, we all are taking it pretty seriously, right? That graph I showed, the capital flow, that's why we're taking it seriously, right? Is there a real threat? Well, we would be foolish to not at least pay attention to it. Comments about, what is the U.S. beef industry and individual producers, how are they sort of responding to these concerns? This graph right here would suggest that there is really no net negative impact of methane emissions from cattle on warming. Now, the UN, the IPCC, right, the International Panel on Climate Change, that's part of the United Nations. This is, when everybody says stuff like, all scientists agree about global warming or whatever, they're saying that this committee it's got 100 people on it, and they're real scientists, right? They're not charlatans. These are some of the world's leading atmospheric physicists and people from all walks of life. That's the consensus group that they're talking about. That panel in their most recent report has already said that GWP star is a reasonable and appropriate metric to evaluate the warming impact of ongoing methane emissions, or short-lived climate pollutants is what they would call that. That's already in the report. Now, if that gets generally accepted, then beef doesn't have a problem as long as you count the entire system, right? The land accumulation part of the system. But now you're back, should you sell that off to American Airlines? To me, the real debates and concerns over the next 5 to 10 years, and unfortunately it'll take at least that long to play out, are about how do we actually measure and assess all of these things? It's not trivial, it's a hard thing to do. But as better and better resolution about the actual impacts of these activities emerges, then I think it shifts the attention. You can already look today at where most sort of really kind of hawkish, you would say, environmental atmospheric science groups are. They're not interested in cattle. That's not where the problem is, and they know that. That doesn't mean that a group that has an agenda other than the environment, right, won't weaponize that message and use that to try to change policy that they want to change. The last thing I'll comment about that, to date, the U.S. government's stance on all of these things has been to avoid a strict regulatory framework. That's good news in my opinion, right? The government is saying, these things are problems, and we're concerned about them, and the public's concerned about it, and business is concerned. We're going to invest in solutions, but we're not going to do that by imposing such stringent regulations that you can't operate. Hence, $180 a ton for direct air capture. That's not saying you have to go do it. That's dangling the carrot out there saying maybe you want to try. I think because of that in the United States, despite our general animosity towards government, right, which it doesn't matter what government it is, we hate them all. I mean, most of us do. Whichever ones we voted for, as soon as they're in there, we hate them. Because we're Americans. That's what we do, right? The government, I think, doesn't want to regulate these activities and recognizes the importance of the United States of America in global stability because of food production. What happened when Ukraine got in trouble a year ago? Right? $8 corn in America, right? I mean, I guess, take it where you can find it. But what would happen if the U.S. food system got cut in half because of a U.S. government policy? It would be global world war, ladies and gentlemen. It wouldn't be just like an economic disruption. So I think that the regulatory environment is not as unfriendly as we perceive it to be, and the opportunities for emergent solutions and evidence to kind of overwhelm and redirect attention where it belongs is actually really high. So I'm actually very optimistic about that. We just have to recognize those things where they're at and address them in the short term. But great question. Sorry I rambled so long on the answer. You had something up front? Can I just hand my microphone over like that?
It's an unreality question maybe, but so let's say you had an 80 acres piece of ground, and so let's say you were growing some kind of post or something or whatever that was solid on 80 acres, and you harvested the post, but you didn't burn them, you used them in deals, and then you planted that back to grass. It's kind of a queer question, but so how would that fit into the carbon formula of how they would evaluate that? You're taking all that off there, you're not burning it, you're using it, and then you're planting it to perennial vegetation. How would that equate into the rules?
Okay. No, that's actually an excellent question. So I'm going to make sure that I got it right. So let's say you had 80 acres that you had planted in wood, like I'm going to say timber. Your intention might have been to harvest it and utilize it as fence posts, but you could have just easily sold those fence posts, right? Whether you use them or somebody else. How does that all fit in? And then it goes back to grass in a rotation, maybe a 20-year rotation or something. The most well-established market for carbon credits in the world, much less the United States, is that. They've been selling carbon credits on timber plantations for decades. It's been around a long time. How does it work? For a timber company, they count the carbon stored in the trees, not under the ground, the above ground part. There is an engineering formula that says if I have this many board feet of standing timber, if I wait 10 more years to harvest it, it'll accumulate X amount more carbon. I was going to cut it down here and I waited 10 years. It got this much more. When I cut it down, process it into lumber, and you use it as a fence post or somebody builds a house with it, that's got a 75-year life. And even if I put it in a landfill, that wood's going to take another 75 years to break down. They account for all of that, adjust based on the board feet of timber, how many carbon credits it represents, and you could absolutely trade that as a timber credit. Now, on the backside, if you replanted it to grass after that harvest and let it grow up and it accumulated more soil carbon as a result of that, would you be able to sell that as well? Sure. The only prohibition there would be in some of the soil carbon contracts is a prior activity rule that would say, well, you can't on purpose, like I can't take some pristine tall grass prairie and go and plow it 18 inches deep, right, and let it sit for a year because I'm going to release some carbon if I do that, right? If I did that and then went back and measured it and said, this is my starting point, right? All I'm really gaining there is what I gave away, and they're not going to allow you to do that. So the only real issue in the example you gave would be, what do you actually do, and would they allow that prior activity, or would that imperil you in some way? And you just need to find out before you started. But it would be entirely feasible to do what you suggested and market the carbon credits in the timber as well as potential accumulation in the soil following replanting from the timber harvest. Great question.
I think we've got time for one more question. So if someone's got one, we'll.
Yeah, excellent information. My name's David Grieger. I actually work here, so this won't be not that intelligent a question, but historically, and it might be investment, how did carbon credits start as far as paying and buying those? Was that industry or government regulations, like you said, for timber? They've been doing that for decades. So that is economic based for a starting business or growth of the industry. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So I'm going to restate, make sure I understood. The basic question there is, how did these markets originally emerge? What was the impetus for that original emergence? Is that a fair summary? Okay. And you gave the two answers, right? Was it sort of an organic emergence, right? People doing business and there's some business benefit and they made a market, right? Just like I never knew I needed a smartphone until somebody invented one, and now I have one, and now I pay extortionate amounts of money for it, right? So that's, I'd call that sort of the organic market development. The other would be the government said, everybody has to have a tracking device on them. We're going to make a law about that, so now everybody has one. Still a smartphone, y'all with me? Right? There's two ways we could have gotten there. I'm going to submit to you that if it was the latter, our phones would be way crappier than they currently are, pardon the language. The organic market development tends to result in innovation and enhancement and advancement versus the regulatory static nature of those things. So how did this market come to be? Both ways. Both ways. In Europe, they have regulated cap and trade. People ask me sometimes, why is a carbon credit in Europe worth $80 and in the US nominally 20? And the 20, guys, is like kind of made up. The very few trades that have occurred have been around 20 bucks because, like, I don't know, it's a round number. Not because there's really been any price discovery, because the market is so thin, nobody knows what they're worth and nobody knows how much to pay for them. So $20 is just enough to kind of get the wheels turning. Okay, but in Europe, the European Union said, okay, we're only going to emit this much stuff because of the Paris Accords, and that means your company can emit this much, and you that much, and you that much, and next year you have to cut by 5% and so on for the next 20 years, and if you don't, we're going to fine the tar out of you. And so those companies now have a lot of motivation to go buy a carbon credit. That was a regulatory induction. The US is strictly voluntary, right? And so both of those mechanisms. And California would be the exception in the US. California passed their own state level cap and trade law. Remember that Chicago Climate Exchange thing? That was because of California demanding credits, right, from the marketplace that weren't available. So you make a market. That's really the only regulated example in the US. Everything else is voluntarily emergent. Great question.